This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
Welcome everyone, those who have been here before and those who are new. This is the German philosophy seminar for the ones who are new of the Institute of Germanic and Roman Studies. We've been having this seminar since 2008, and we spend it reading German philosophical texts and discussing them. An historical approach with also reference to contemporary issues. And last semester we looked at Wagner, and that turned out to be a very popular topic because we never had so many participants. And now we are sort of back to the hardcore, which is very good. But there is a bit of a link between the last session and this session. We read two texts by Bloch about Wagner, and we're going to now look at a book by Bloch. So the whole seminar from now until December, we meet twice weekly as normally, will be devoted to this single book, Geist, Utopie, Spirit of Utopia, which was Ernst Bloch's first published book, and it's a book from 1918. There are various versions, so we'll look at how they have developed over the years as we get on. So I'm very happy to do a seminar on Bloch, because you know that that's sort of my main area of work. And I think it's also good for those who are not Blochians here to realize that probably the three people who make up the Bloch posse in the UK are here. Peter Thompson, Kent Moyer, who is Peter's PhD student, and myself. So I think for those of you who want to get an interest or want to find out and learn about Bloch, this is probably the best collection of people, the best group that you could wish for at this point in time in this country. And I hope that we will be able to convey something of the interest in this person. Normally our way of working is, as I just said, is that we have a number of pages that we read prepare for the session, and we discuss it. I will give a little bit of an introduction now, not too long. And because we haven't had any set reading for today, we will look at just the opening of Geist der Utopie, the first few lines. We'll look at those. And I also want to, as a way of getting into the study of what Bloch is all about, I want to look at a short story from a later book by Bloch, Spuren, translated as Traces, which we have also in a nice version on YouTube, where Bloch's son reads it out. So we will look at that, and then we will. I've given you the text. It's behind it's in the handout that I've given you. We'll get to it in a minute, and we will discuss that and look at what the motives are there. Now. In a way, getting into the philosophy of Bloch is very difficult, because you could say, let's say Bloch himself said at one point that the good thing about religion is that it produces heretics, and I think that applies also to himself and to his own position in philosophy. He has always been a heretic right from the start, and has always remained that. And there is something about his work that doesn't fit any of the prescribed canons of institutionalized philosophy, of institutionalized theology, or any of the other branches of the academy, so to speak. He is a perennial outsider, and that means that engaging with him means engaging with that problematic complex. We're dealing with works, ideas that can only with difficulty be perhaps made part of larger, more mainstream discourses. We are meeting, in a way, a strange person, a strange thinker, somebody who has idiosyncratic ideas and who is trying to convey always the same point in different words and in different contexts, always the same point, which you can grasp after a while, but which remains perhaps unsettling, and perhaps that's also one of the main functions of it. We see that quite clearly in this book, his first book. I'll say a little bit about the history in a minute, which is written in a style that after maybe 50 or 100 pages gets to get on your nerves for a lot of people, and maybe even sooner than that. Other people may like it, but there's something very peculiar about the style. It is almost as if the book tries to, like a good like a good Jewish rabbi, if you knock on his door and say, I want to convert to Judaism, he says, go away. And I think there's something in this book that functions in the same way. If you say to the book, I want to understand what you're saying, it says, go away. Yeah, you won't like it. So I think that's maybe one of the things to realize as we approach this text. For me, that's a very important point. As we approach this text, we have to ask ourselves, what does it mean to read? What does it mean to read this text? How should we read it? And one of the ways in which we, I think, should not read it is we should not approach it with the mindset of, let's see what this dude has got to say, and can we spell it out in arguments. There is a movement of thought, there is a spirit that is trying to be communicated here, and that's what we have got to put ourselves in a position of sort of a willingness to engage with that. I think that's an important point. I had to think myself as I was preparing this, I had to think of the old, again a religious motive. This whole semester will be full of references to religion. I had to think of the old theory of the lectio divina, the divine reading of scripture, in which you start with reading a sentence, and then you ponder its meaning, and then after you've pondered its meaning, you enter into an attitude which is called prayer or oratio, in which in a praying sort of way you engage with the meaning of the text, and after that you get contemplatio, which is then a communication with God as to the real core of what is being said there. That is how in the tradition people have spoken about reading the Holy Scriptures, reading the Bible, and that's a different kind of reading than looking for information or looking for arguments. Now, I'm not going to say that Geist Utopie is holy writ, but I do think there is something about the style that necessitates that kind of reading. You could even, I'm not going to go there, but you could probably, if you read it through Walter Benjamin's eyes, you could say that maybe there is a kind of holiness in the message that is being communicated. There is definitely a mystical underlayer in this text. I wouldn't go so far to say there is a mystical text, but there is a mystical substructure that will be important for us to unearth. Why is Geist Utopie an interesting book at the moment? Well, for me that's very simple. The speaking from philosophy, the days of hardcore postmodernism, in which philosophy was thought to be at an end, and we were all locked up in discourse idealisms of all sorts, are over. We again ask the question, what is reality, what is truth? There is an appetite for speculation, there is an appetite for thinking ahead, for formulating alternatives, intellectually but also politically, to the present state in which we are living, and that is an atmosphere that is very much in accordance with what Bloch is doing as well, and how he is writing in this book. This is a kind of thinking that tries to live into the new, that tries to live into the future. It is a thinking that is determined by futurity. Bloch sees that himself as a break with tradition. He sees Western philosophy as enwrapped in a figure of anamnesis, of remembrance, of looking at truth, thinking about reality as that which always already was, in reference to Aristotle's concept of essence, toti and einai in Greek, which for Aristotle, he explains that quite literally in the Metaphysics, means that which always already was. Essence is seen in philosophy, in the tradition of philosophy, as that which something always already was. What is the essence of a human being is that which that human being always already was. Bloch transforms that notion of essentiality into the essence of something is that which it not yet is. And that is a radical shift. That shift is so radical in the way it is enacted in this book in 1918 that Bloch is forced or wants to what he calls salvaging, that he wants to rescue the tradition. He wants to put himself in the language of the tradition in order to say something that is very revolutionary. That is another... Hi. Yes, do come in. Yeah, I'm just giving an introduction. Yeah, that is the. I think that is a very important point to keep in the back of your minds as we are going through this text. Gershom Scholem writes somewhere in his book on Jewish mysticism that mystics, and again this is the theme of mysticism, mystics need the structure of an institutionalized framework in which their explosive or disruptive or transformative ideas and messages can be contained. And that is exactly the same idea as the one that I mentioned just now, that religion produces heretics in the form of mystics. But you see Bloch doing something similar with respect to the philosophical tradition. So he calls himself a Hegelian, he calls himself a Marxist, etc., in order to say something that has not been said there. And that is his thinking or living into the new. Yeah? That is what the figure of utopia in a way means. It means much more, but that's maybe a starting point for us to get to see what he is driving at. Bloch is not the only one in this time, the early 20th century, to talk about the new. The new is something that in art, also in other thinkers, in American pragmatism, in the beginnings of existentialism, plays a big role. Bloch has a unique take on it, and I think one of the things that we might do today is to try to get an understanding of where he is coming from and why his way of conceptualizing living into the new, this existential moment of transformation, of going to an unknown horizon and not yet, what is so particular about that? And I'll say something about it, but we can see it in the text that I've given for discussion as well. I'll give you just a few facts for those who don't know these things about Bloch. This is a picture here where you see him as a young man. I didn't have any better image. It's a slightly expressionistic painting by a painter called Willy Geiger, and the expressionism fits in very well with the text of Geist, Utopie. This is what he looked like around the time of writing this. I'll give you just a few facts. Yeah? Bloch was born in 1885 in Ludwigshafen, in what is now Rhineland-Pfalz. It was then still Bavaria, Bayern. And Ludwigshafen was a new town, was an industrial city, was dominated by a class division, especially at the end of the 19th century, and it's located on the Rhine, and on the opposite side of the city is the city of Mannheim. Mannheim was an old residential, palatial city. The biggest palace in Europe after Versailles was there. Mozart had worked there as Kapellmeister. Schiller's Räuber had its premiere, its Uraufführung there, and that was a rich town. It was a bourgeois town with a beautiful palace with a beautiful library in the palace. And then on the other side there was Ludwigshafen, which had not the largest palace but the largest chemical plant, the Badische Anilin- und Soda-Fabrik, the BASF, which still exists, still dominates that part of Germany there. So you have in this combination of these twin cities with the Rhine flowing in between it, you have already an image of a class division. You have the image almost of a historical materialist reality that Bloch grew up in, and that later on he's written about this, also became an important inspiration for him. He had a very poor time in school. He only barely passed his exam, and when one of his teachers asked him what he was going to do, and he said, I'm going to study philosophy, the Oberlehrer said, dafür sind Sie doch viel zu dumm. You're far too stupid for that. Yeah? But he nevertheless did that, went to Munich and then to Würzburg. We'll see that coming in today. And in Würzburg there was an experimental psychology school founded by a man called Kölperer, who also was a neo-Kantian. And there Bloch engaged in psychological experiments. So we'll see something of the basis of Geist und Utopie in a kind of an empirical approach to psychology a bit later on today when we look at the letter that I've photocopied for you. So he stayed there only for 6 semesters. He studied only for 6 semesters, and then he got his PhD. So after 3 years of university study, went to Berlin, where he became a member of the circle around Georg Simmel. And he became a good friend of Simmel, which lasted until the outbreak of the First World War, when Simmel was very much on the side of the fractions in Germany who wanted to go to war, and Bloch was very much a pacifist and against the war. So that was the moment where their friendship broke up. He left for Switzerland, wrote vehemently in the newspapers and in journals against the war, and worked on his book, Geist und Utopie, which was published in 1918, although he'd finished it in 1917, but because of a shortage in paper, because of the war, it could not be printed until 1918. Around that time he had married Else von Stritzky, a sculptor from, I don't know where she was from.
Yeah.
Riga, yeah, exactly. A sculptor from a very rich sculptor from Riga. In the letters that I read as preparation for the seminar, it turns out that so Else von Stritzky is the one to whom the book is dedicated, and also somebody for whom he Bloch kept a lifelong, very deep affection. If you go to his study, which is preserved in Ludwigshafen, there's still a picture of her on a little table in the corner of the room, and he kept that all his life. It's a very important person in his life. Yet it turns out, I read the letters just now, it's very interesting, that at first he had no intentions of marrying her, and she was just a friend. They had agreed that they would just be friends, but nevertheless she sponsored him. She paid him 100 rubles a month because she was so wealthy, and nobody was to know this except Georg Lukács, who was his closest friend in those years. Georg Lukács knew about it, but nobody else knew about it, especially his parents were not to know that he was not independent. And the story that he had invented was that he was working as a reporter for a feminist journal, Frau der Zukunft, which I read this yesterday, which wasn't true at all. But nevertheless, this kept him. The journal existed, yeah. This kept him going for a while. But after a while, a very deep love blossomed up between the two, and they married. Else von Stritzky was very sick already at that time and died in 1921, which set off a depression that lasted a year or so in Bloch. After which he moved to Berlin. He published a book on Thomas Münzer, the Thuringian priest who was the leader of the peasants' uprising in Thuringia in the 14th century. Went to Berlin, met Adorno there, met Brecht, met Benjamin he had known in Switzerland already, and in 1930 published a book of short stories, Spuren. That's the one that we will read a story from in a little while. In 1935 he published Erbschaft dieser Zeit, Heritage of Our Times, which is one of the first deep analysis of the rise of fascism and why fascism became such an important force in Germany. One of the reasons that he pays most attention to is the fact that fascism filled a need for myth that is genuine and that doesn't go away, and that the left, communism, had not been able to fill with its excessive programmatic and quantitative approach to politics. He, of course, had to leave Germany in 1933 when Hitler came to power. Via France, Switzerland, Czechoslovakia, he ended up in the United States, first in New York, later in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where he actually got into quite an isolation. He still knew the people at the Frankfurt Institute that had moved to Columbia University, but they never gave him a job, and he had his own circle of friends, but on the whole lived quite an isolated life, working in the University Library of Harvard, where he wrote between 1938 and 1948 a number of books. It was a very productive time for him. That's of course what you get when you don't have any friends. So he wrote a book on Hegel, subject-object. He wrote a book on social utopias, Freiheit und Ordnung, which later became part of Das Prinzip Hoffnung, the principle of hope, which he's mostly known by, which is sort of his magnum opus, a 3-volume heavy piece of writing, a typical German book all about everything, as it says on as a reviewer wrote somewhere. That was published only in 1959, but he finished it in 1948. He wrote more things. He wrote a long book on materialism, which was published in the early 70s. After the war, he became a professor of philosophy at the University of Leipzig. He was a communist, he was a Marxist, and he believed that he could contribute to the creation of a state of really real existing socialism. That became a big disillusion around 1956 at the time of the Hungarian uprising, in the discussion around which he condemned the politics of the Soviets to crush that, and of course became a persona non grata because of that. His students were also prosecuted, and some of them landed up in prison. He left after a couple of years of virtual house arrest. He left the GDR in 1961 and was in the West when the wall was being erected in Berlin, and never came back. He became a visiting professor at the University of Tübingen, where in the 1960s he started to exercise, to really become famous, you could say, started to exercise an enormous influence on the student protest movement, on student activism. He became a good friend of Rudi Dutschke, who was one of the leaders of the student movement in Germany, published a book every year in his collected works, which he planned himself. And this kept going on until 1977, when he died, literally on the day at which he finished the last book in his own collected works. So it's a remarkable story. He lived until he was 93 or 92 or something, 92, yeah, and worked practically all his life, wrote all his life, thought all his life, and died, yeah, as I said, died right after he put the last full stop on the paper. There is on YouTube, if you look for it, there's a lot of footage where he speaks, where you hear him speak, where you see him speak, interviews, etc., etc. It gives you a bit of a sense of who we're dealing with here. It's a very remarkable personality. People who have known him say this also about him. He's a very warm person, but also very present, very rhetorically gifted, a real public figure, but also a fundamental and subtle thinker. So that's a little bit about him, about his life, and so now we have this book here, yeah, this first book. Okay, so if we, let me just say a little bit about the context, the philosophical context in which this book arrived. Well, first about the cultural context. Of course, written between 1915 and 1917, as it says himself in the beginning of the book, which is probably true. It was written during the First World War, during the Great War, a time of utter disillusionment in Europe. That must not be underestimated, the conditions in which he wrote this book. And the book is in part also set up as a way out of the total deprivation that had taken hold, certainly of Germany, but at a slightly wider extent, probably all of Europe at that time. It is a book that tries to find an answer to, if I want to put it in the most general sense, try to find an answer to nihilism. He speaks himself in the book of the second movement, the second stage of modernism that is to begin with this book. first modernism had been a destruction of illusions of transcendence, of hierarchy, of natural order in things, etc., etc. But out of that destruction, something had to come. And we can see that this for him begins in this existential movement of living into the new that is part of the structure of subjectivity of all of us. And he says this, somewhere in the book he says this is the beginning of a new phase in modernism. Now, actually let me just, if you all have the text, if you take even the first sentence of the 1918 edition, you see how this happens in a way. So the section entitled Absicht. That's the same in the other one. Yeah. Absicht. Well, so the first sentence is a question. Wie nun? Yeah. What now? I'm now in the 1918 edition. In the 1923 edition he says, Ich bin, wir sind, das ist genug, nun haben wir zu beginnen. In the 1918 edition he says, Wie nun, es ist genug, nun haben wir zu beginnen. Ja? In unsere Hände ist das Leben gegeben, für sich selbst ist es längst schon leer geworden. Es taumelt sinnlos hin und her, aber wir stehen fest und so wollen wir ihm seine Faust und seine Ziele werden. Can you read it in German?
No, I can't, and my English copies come at the end of the week. So.
Can you read it out in German, Phil? Or in English?
In English? It's got the 1918 version. I am, we are, that is enough. Now we have to begin.
Go on.
Life has been put in our hands. For itself, it became empty already long ago. It pitches senselessly back and forth, but we stand firm. And so we want to be its initiative, and we want to be its ends.
Yeah. So you see how the, even in the rhetorical structure, how the text creates a rupture in history even. So in the act of reading, it is almost as if the moment of beginning again for oneself is given to the reader. Yeah. And that is I think this moment of rupture, the second phase of modernity, has a lot to do with the time in which the book was written. Now, in terms of the philosophical context, Bloch as a high school student, he recalls in one of his later interviews, as a high school student, he often took the trip to Mannheim over the bridge to the library in the palace, not to go to school, but rather go to the library and read philosophy there. And he says that the library stopped buying philosophy at around the middle of the 19th century. So all he had there were the German idealists. And he says the complete ideological rainbow from Leibniz to Schelling was there, but nothing else. And this is a little bit stylized, of course. But and he says this is all I knew. And there in the late 19th century, in the 1890s, I was sitting at the feet of Hegel, and I was learning philosophy in that way. And he says, I read Hegel at 15 or 16. I read him erotically. I misunderstood him, and yet I understood him in a certain way correctly. And I think that's probably true. We'll see what he means by that in a minute. So Bloch is somebody who right from the start has a conception of philosophy that belongs not in the late 19th century, but in the early 19th century. It's a romantic, idealist version of philosophy as a thinking of the whole. As Hegel had said, the das Wahre is das Ganze, the true is the whole. I think that is something that Bloch never gives up. And he connects that strain of what you might now call idealism. I think what it really is a kind of speculative moment in philosophy. He combines that also from the start with an existentialist interest, which basically goes back to Kierkegaard, I think. Certainly in Geist, Utopie, that's a very important motive. At the beginning for yourself, the leap of faith, the movement into something unknown in which we take charge, in which we take life into our own hands, as he says in that section that we just read out. And this is a combination that later on, also there's a third element added, that's Marxism, materialism, right from the start seen in the materialist context. That is a combination, let's say, Hegel plus Kierkegaard plus materialism is Bloch. Yeah? Now, of course, Hegel and Kierkegaard are in many ways each other's opposites, as you may know. Kierkegaard spent most of his life explaining why Hegel was wrong in about everything he said. Yeah? But Bloch never gives that up. I think it has to do with what I said earlier, this need to embed yourself in a tradition. But it's certainly the case, and that's also true for Geist der Utopie, that no matter how much it speaks to the present cultural context in which it is written, it is a book of perennial philosophy. It is a book in which age-old questions are being asked, in which somebody tries to come to terms with the fundamental question, what is the meaning of the one and what is the meaning of the all, of Hen Kai Pan, as the German idealists said. So,
how did he pass Nietzsche?
Yeah, Nietzsche is very important for Bloch. Yeah, so let me say, I'm going to say this now. Yeah, so we have in his own background we have speculative philosophy, German idealism, as the starting point for his philosophical sensibilities. Now, I think you must not underestimate the desert landscape that philosophy had become in the end of the 19th century. I think not just in Germany but everywhere it had succumbed completely to the rise of the sciences, to a scientific atmosphere, which you can see even in somebody like Marx and certain turning points. Schopenhauer was the closest that came to a philosopher that had any recognition in those years. There was a person in German intellectual life, Ernst Haeckel, who defended a materialism of the most blunt, in the most sort of blunt terms. Everything, well, what is real is atoms. So what is real is molecules, or something like that. That sort of materialism, scientific materialism, and I think that dominated a lot of the discussions in intellectual life, and that's something that for Bloch was right from the start impossible to accept. So while we see him early on becoming a materialist in the sense of not accepting a transcendent realm of normativity or of ultimate reality, and that's very much the reading of Nietzsche that did that for him. Nietzsche says the horizon has been wiped out, there is no world beyond. Yeah, that is a very strong motive for Bloch as well, and that leads him to materialism in a way. Yeah? But never the materialism of Haeckel. Now, in philosophy, what you had in those times was Kant, neo-Kantianism. He writes somewhere at the universities in those days it was Kant, and more Kant. And that was, of course, understandable, because if a philosopher wants to keep a job in a world which is dominated by science, then what can you do? You can say, well, science has its own sphere of legitimacy, but there are certain questions regarding the foundations of scientific knowledge that science cannot answer. And then we are, if we accept the fact that scientific truth is what we is the best that we can attain, then you almost automatically get a Kantian position. Yeah, or not? You don't agree with that, Phil?
No, I agree.
Yeah, I think that's certainly how it went here, and you can see that very clearly in the work of Ernst Mach. And Ernst Mach was also became one of the important people in the development of logical positivism in the early 20th century, but in the late 19th century was a well-respected physicist, but also philosopher of science. And Mach writes somewhere, Whitehead also quotes it. So Mach writes somewhere, on a beautiful summer's morning, the whole world appeared to me like one big mass of experiences. So in Mach, you get, from the point of view of philosophy of science, around the end of the 19th century, you get a formulation of a kind of positivism, subjective positivism, in which the guarantee for truth and reality is located in the experience, and the experience is seen as something that does not require anything outside of itself, to be what it is. Mach was a scientist. Mach had to rescue the idea of objective knowledge, that the sciences actually deal with something. So what did he say? He said the constancy in our experiences, that is what science formulates. It shows that in our experience which is always the same. And that in our experience which is always the same, we might call that Stoff. We might call that matter, stuff, that which is sort of outside of, which probably is that which is outside of our experiences, guaranteeing their constancy. So that's almost a Kantian move. So there is a limit notion of matter which I need in order to have a methodology that allows me to be as scientific as I can, to say that only scientific knowledge is real or is the best knowledge that we can have, but not to let that collapse into a complete subjective idealism. I need this reference to a matter, but it's completely open. It's like Kant's thing in itself. It's I can't say anything more about it. And philosophy, as it were, becomes nothing more than a realization of the fact that experience has this limit in itself, which we might call that which is matter, or that which is Stoff. And that I think is a very important starting point for Bloch. We see him as a young student when he was still in high school, corresponding with Mach. So this is another interesting thing, that this student who was doing so poorly and obviously was not paying, his mind was not with school, but he was corresponding with Mach about these things in a completely bombastic way, as an 18-year-old might do, certainly of Bloch's persuasion. So he was almost lecturing to the great professor. And so what I've given you, I just want to show that to you now, what I've given you is the one letter that remains of this early correspondence of the very young Bloch, in which, well, we're not going to read all of it, but in which he deals with this idea of Stoff, and in which he takes up a very strange position in relation to what I've just explained about Mach, because he says, yeah. 1 and 2 and 3. There we go. Yeah. So he says, it's in the middle of page 20, roughly. Well, let's read from the top. Wo die Naturwissenschaft mit dem Körperbegriff als letztem selbstverständlichen Resultat ihrer Reduktion rechnet, da erst sieht die Philosophie ihr tiefstes Problem. So, translating roughly when Mach says, I only need this limit notion of matter to ground my positivism with respect to scientific methodology, Bloch says, yeah, but that is the beginning of philosophy. It might be the end of the methodology of science, but that's the beginning of philosophy, because what does that mean? Yeah? And then he says, der Stoffbegriff, die Materie als Untergrund aller Erscheinungen, so the concept of stuff, matter as a substrate of all experiences, kann nur psychologisch überwunden werden, can only be conquered, can only be sublated psychologically. Psychology is called to replace historical philosophy in the same way in which astrology has replaced astronomy and alchemy and chemistry has been replaced by alchemy. Astronomy has replaced astrology, of course. Yeah? It is the critical analysis of the act of knowledge, a critical analytical test of the empirically last concepts, and that is what will inherit, and you see this idea already coming up here, inherit philosophy. And then he says a leitmotif for this critical work, and he says, I have called this the principle of phenomenality, principium he says Satz der Phänomenalität, and then in order to make clear that Mach knows that he's not from the street, he says principium phenomenalitatis. And then he says this is the royal road in which all of philosophy as a critical science can be comprised. All the rest is exegesis and elaboration. And it is in its shortest formulation esse est percipi, and that is of course Berkeley's statement. You will know this probably from Berkeley, the Bishop Berkeley, who said, "To be is to be perceived." Yeah, and that is strange for somebody who becomes historical materialist a little bit later, to see that here in this, because this is an 18-year-old writing, and we shouldn't take this too seriously, but to see that here he sees himself forced, and we have to take seriously that he was grappling with these questions. He sees himself forced to espouse the position of an extreme subjective idealism, and to say, moreover, this is not transcendental philosophy, but it's psychology. Esse est percipi is a question of experimental psychology, to find out what that means. Yeah. So, Mach, of course, didn't want to go that far. That's what is at stake here. Yeah? Later on in Geist der Utopie, we'll see that Bloch gives a very negative evaluation of experimental psychology as something that really is the death of philosophy. Yeah? In his discussion of the contemporary state in philosophy. Yeah? But I think that. And I think he left that path in the early years of 20th century and saw in its failure an extra reason to take materiality seriously. The beginnings of Bloch's thought here lay in the realization that there is something like a consciousness of the not yet. Objective fantasy, as he calls it in the very early text, also from high school, and the attempt to reclaim the ground of speculative philosophy on the initial basis of the epistemological debates of the late 19th century. The theme of the dream, so central to all of his works, is here already stirring in the background. Say esse est percipi is a way of saying there's something about the dream that is very important. Subjective idealism, so what appears here as subjective idealism, is the first shining through, as it were, of this idea that what he later comes to call, and we'll see that, the darkness of the lived moment, the experience of myself as not having or being myself, but having to become myself, he mistakes that here as a form of subjective idealism. But why does he do that? Why does he come to say here, this is actually psychology, and it is esse est percipi, die Welt ist durch und durch Vorstellung, Erscheinung, intellektuelles Phänomen? He still speaks the language of Kantianism, as it were, tries to formulate the idea that it is our thinking ahead, our fantasy, our representation, our Vorstellung, which gives the clue to how we have to understand what philosophy is trying to do, how we have to understand the whole and the one. And you see, so that's maybe not entirely clear here, but what I'm trying to say is he uses the language of Kantianism to make a point that later on he comes to realize has got nothing to do with the Kantian structure. And because he is writing and he's thinking in these frameworks that dominate philosophy at the time, he comes out with something that sounds like an extreme subjective idealism. You could almost say, coming back to your point about Nietzsche could also say esse est percipi, couldn't he? I mean, that's a way of almost a way of saying saying what Nietzsche says. So the early Bloch seems to have wanted to ontologize Mach's empiricism. Mach said, Stoff, matter, what's real is just a limit notion within experience. What Bloch does here is ontologize implicitly the act of experience. And later on he will say, and this is a very, very peculiar formulation in Geist Utopie, isn't phenomenology really ontology? Now, of course, to write that in 1918, before Heidegger, before Sartre, who's in Lettres linéaires, subtitle Lettres linéaires is an ontological phenomenology. I think that is all goes back to this point of subjective idealism that keeps coming up here. So Bloch gives up the idea of Stoff initially, except insofar as this is the stuff of experience, that which is always experienced again, and seemingly adopts an extreme subjective idealism. This is, however, subjected on one side to an existentialism of Kierkegaardian, Schellingian provenance already, because it is moral and aesthetic. It's a moral subjectivism, aesthetic subjectivism, and the lived experience of the darkness of the lived moment, and to a dialectic of a left Hegelian or even Marxist provenance, relocating the subject in the dialectical movement of objectification, which puts the subject back and originally so into the world. So he moves from a subjective idealism of experience to what you might call a speculative realism of existence, in which it is the experiential act, the subjective act, that becomes the locus of reality. And now you can understand, this all goes very quickly, we'll see this all very slowly happening as we read the text, but with this you can, I think, understand what he meant when he said, I read Hegel erotically and misunderstood him, and yet I understood him correctly. Because what he read when he read the Phenomenology of Spirit was his own subjective experience translated into a story of the world. So he failed to see that Hegel wasn't writing about my experience, but was writing about the world spirit, and he mistook himself for the world spirit, as it were. And that is something that we find in we talked about Weber. That when he went to Heidelberg after Berlin and he became a member of the circle around Weber, Max Weber had a passionate disliking of him because of his grandiose style. At one point he said, apparently to Max Weber's wife, he said, the history will judge those who are not with me. So I think, there's a lot more to be said about the role of Kant and about the role of these epistemological discussions. But what I wanted to say with this is basically that the moment Geist Utopie starts, we have already had this whole struggle with idealism, with subjective idealism, and he has found a position in which it is possible to speak from the subjectivity of the lived moment as the starting point, not for a psychological philosophy, but for a speculative philosophy, speculative metaphysics. And there, to say one word about Nietzsche, and there we see Nietzsche is very important as an early text that Bloch wrote before Geist Utopie about Nietzsche. I can't go into that. Hopefully we can do that some other time, or other people know more about that. But I think it is significant that the subtitle of Fröhliche Wissenschaft, the gay science, is Vorspiel einer Philosophie der Zukunft, Prelude to a Philosophy of the Future. And I think it doesn't go too far to say that in Geist Utopie we get one of the first movements of that philosophy of the future, because this is not just a philosophy in the future, but it is a philosophy of the future. It is a philosophy that thinks futurity. And I think in a way in which Nietzsche perhaps only saw coming, saw as possible, and we see it happening here, and I think that definitely Bloch also saw himself as, in this sense, inheriting a very important moment in Nietzsche. There's more to be said about that, but that is just one thing. And now we get to the point, and then I'm going to stop so you can say something as well. now we come to the point where we can begin to see that in this book, and we have to see how, of course, when we read it, in this book philosophy is reinvented. And I think that is probably, certainly in the modern time, but perhaps even going back in history, before that, that is the only criterion you can give of what a real philosophy is. It is the reconstitution of the philosophical questions on a new plane, or in a different language, and that is what's happening here. So that's also fits in with the historical materialist understanding of history. There are all sorts of influences, but they are not necessarily causal. They lead somebody, a thinker, at some point to reconstitute the whole field of philosophy. And that is what happens in this book. Yeah? So that's what we will try to understand as we read it, how that works and what it is. I already said, I think, before we started when we were talking, that the book had quite an impact. It is part of expressionism. It is part of this move towards the subject, and move towards pathos, and move towards the indirect. That is part of expressionism. It had an impact in Germany after the war. The first review of it was written by Margareta Sussman, a writer, who writes in this a bit of romantic image, but she says in this dark snowy winter's night of the end of the war, this book was like a brightly lit window in a house that you see somewhere, and I think a lot of people felt it that way. Benjamin wrote to Scholem. We will read Benjamin Scholem correspondence about Geist or Utopie. Scholem doesn't like it at all, and Benjamin's always a difficult person. We'll talk about maybe that in a minute as well. But Benjamin writes that several of the most important ideas for him he owes to a reading of Geist or Utopie. He wrote a very long review of the book, which sadly has been lost, and that's of course a big shame, because we would have liked to know what it was that he got from that. When you read it, you will find out, you will see terms that you see coming up in Benjamin later on all the time. Adorno was very much, as a young man, he was 17 or so when it was published, was very impressed by the book. I've got one little quotation that I'd like to read out to you, because that captures a lot of the spirit, I think, of the book. So later in life, Adorno writes about his first encounter with this book. The dark brown volume of, it's on the back here projected, of over 400 pages, printed on thick paper, promised something of what one hopes for from medieval books, something I'd felt as a child at home in the calf leather Heldenschatz, a belated 18th century book of magic full of abstruse instructions, many of which I'm still pondering. The spirit of Utopia looked as though it had been written by Nostradamus himself. The name Bloch had the same aura, dark as a gateway with a muffled blare like a trumpet blast that aroused the expectation of something vast, an expectation that quickly rendered the philosophy with which I had become acquainted as a student suspect and shallow, and unworthy of its own concept. I had the feeling that here philosophy had escaped the curse of being official. Bloch's was a philosophy that could hold its head high before the most advanced literature, a philosophy that was not calibrated to the abominable resignation of methodology. The book seemed to me to be one prolonged rebellion against the renunciation within thought that extends even into its purely formal character. So this is, of course, Adorno looking back. He probably wouldn't have said that at the time, but I think there are some very important aspects here. A rebellion against renunciation within thought, and that's also, as I said in the beginning, one of the reasons for reading this book today, because I think we are very much feeling the need for that kind of rebellion ourselves. The thing about the materiality of the book, I tried to get the first edition into the seminar today. The Warburg Institute has one, but they wouldn't let me take it out. You can go there and have a look at it. It's really beautiful. It's a big book. It's about this thick, and it looks like a sorcerer's book from the Middle Ages, with sort of Bloch in big letters on the printed on the cover. It's really amazing, and it has that element of magic about it. It has that element of, and I think that's what I meant when I spoke about a holy text. It has that element of the text is alive, as the Kabbalist said about the Torah. It's not a book. It's alive. It's living. And according to Kabbalistic mysticism, the Bible contains the lives of everyone who reads it, of every people who's ever lived, really, not as in a mirror, but really actually, it's in there. And I think that's something that Adorno maybe experienced when he saw this book. There is a kind of hope. I don't know if you have experienced this ever, but I certainly have, I think many people, the hope that you find a book like that. I think as a child, people were probably sensitive to this, that the wish for a magical book, yeah, a book that somehow contains the world, but not descriptively, but really, that gives a key to it, an ontological key, and that is more than just a Walt Disney sentiment or so. I think that has to do with how this book reconstitutes the field of philosophy. Yeah.
How do you know why the book was? Because I mean, look, it's not that big. Like, why was it like that? Why was it printed like that and bound like that?
Yeah, I don't know. It could, of course, be completely coincidental, namely the fact that there wasn't a lot of paper. Yeah. So it probably was printed on cheap paper. It could also be, I don't know of any correspondence in which it turns out that Bloch had anything to say in how it was published. He would certainly have liked that.
Yeah.
Because he writes that he wrote it he wrought it in long nights in Garmisch-Partenkirche, where he lived in a mountain villa, lying on sofas covered in Persian rugs and things like that. So he was sensitive to this kind of aestheticizing the moment of authorship. I don't know. I think I would suspect that it is just a coincidence.
Yeah.
Something that surprised me in reading around of the reviews was that several people write that it is a very modern book at the time. It breathes the spirit of, it is really, ahead of its time. It's right there. It's avant-garde. Whereas if you look at the facsimile of the first edition now, even this, that doesn't look very avant-garde to me. Yeah? It's sort of even, because this is 1918, this is 18 years after Traumdeutung, this is futurists have happened, Kandinsky, etc. I don't see how it breathes that atmosphere. I think over 90% of the books that were printed in Germany at that time were printed in Gothic print still. Yeah, so I think for a German audience it might have looked modern because it used Latin script. That maybe that has got something to do with it. But apparently that is how it was experienced. I think Adorno picked up a much older strand when he says it looks like a book that Nostradamus could have written. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's the contradiction as well. It looks modern, but it's dealing with Gothic ideas.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Latin script with Gothic ideas.
Yeah.
Can I just ask where the Adorno comes from? Which Adorno book that is? Yeah,
you may ask that. I don't know that because I'm quoting it from the bibliography, from the biography. It is. I have read it. It's a text. Or it's a radio talk. I will look it up for you. Yeah, I'll look it up for you. Okay, so let's very quickly look at, because we also have to make up a reading schedule, and then I want to go to the story that we're going to look at for today. Let's very quickly look at the content of the book. So for those who have them both, let me explain this. The book was published in 1918. Bloch then reworked it for a second edition in 1923, published in 1923. There are some differences which I will explain. Somebody in Berlin has now started to really philologically look at how the texts compare, but not a lot of work has been done yet on that, and it's tremendously complex. But that's if you want to. I would say if you have nothing more to do right before the Day of Judgment, then you might want to spend some time working out these differences.
You might even hold up the day of judgment.
About hold up, yeah, hang on. Hang on, we're waiting. But so what happened is this book was republished in 1923, and then it was published again in the collected works. As I said, Bloch worked on publishing his own collected works from about the mid-50s until he died. It was published again in that series in 1964, I think it was, yeah. But of course then it was changed again by Bloch. Bloch was, and this is, I think, fits with his anti-bourgeois attitude. He was not concerned about authorship or ownership of ideas. He plagiarizes all the time, everywhere, himself, but also others, I think, without a lot of... he didn't have this idea of ownership of ideas. And so he quite liberally changes in 1964, changes things from 1918 that he now feels differently about. As if he is producing, again, I think this has to do with this perennial view philosophy, he's producing something for eternity, and it doesn't matter whether it's 1918 or 1964. But of course for us that's a very big difference. And so it's very difficult in this text that we are working with of the 1923 edition, the 1964 publication from the collected works, it's very difficult for us to see what here is 1964 and what is 1923. We would need the 1923 edition, which however is no longer available, and on these British Isles there is only one copy that I've been able to find. It is in the British Library, but there on the catalogue it says book misplaced. So you can't, I can't consult it, and hopefully I'll go to the archive sometime and then be able to have a look at it. But so we're working with the 1964 edition, which is the 1923 edition with some changes, and the 1918 edition, which by a stroke of genius Suhrkamp decided to publish as a facsimile. So we are sure that Bloch did not have his hand in making any changes, and this is really what came out in 1918. Now, if you go to the content of these books, I've made a reading schedule that I will email to everyone. I won't read it out now. So you see that in the 1918 edition, you see that there are two big parts of the book. In abstract, if we ignore the Absicht, and one is called die Selbstbegegnung, and the other one is called Karl Marx, Der Tod und die Apokalypse. I think in the English translation they follow the 1923 edition. Yeah, they have a longer, more detailed table of contents there. So you see, and I think in terms of content of the book, we see that the first part of the book, the biggest part, deals with what Bloch calls Selbstbegegnung, self-encounter. And this is done under a number of thematic topics. First it starts ein alter Krug, which is about the direct physical experience of an object, and that leads into a discussion on art. So basically aesthetics is the topic of the Erzeugung des Ornaments, in which Bloch talks about ornamentation in a time of neue Sachlichkeit. There's an English term for that. What is it? New objectivity. Yeah. In the time of new objectivity, or beginning of new objectivity, he talks about ornamentation. Ornament not as embellishment, but ornament as the exodus moment in which a form transgresses into something unknown as something new. That is how he sees ornament, and therefore ornament becomes a vital aspect in the shaping of daily life and the spaces in which we live. Then there is a discussion on the komische Held, which deals with Don Quixote. Then there is a philosophy of music, and as you can see when you look at the page numbers, that is the biggest chunk of the book, and that remains the same in the 1923 edition. This book is all about music, really. It's all about music. I would, bearing later discussions on music in mind, I would say it tries to look at music as improvisation, as a model for what it means to live into the new. Bloch didn't like jazz, but I think this is a very jazzy book because that's what it is about. It is about what happens in that moment. And then there is a section on Die Gedankenatmosphäre dieser Zeit, in which Bloch confronts himself with philosophical positions of his time. Very interesting discussion that we will look at with Husserl's phenomenology, which of course is very central. And then there is a sector on die Gestalt der unkonstruierbaren Frage, which is where the mystical element of the book comes to the fore most clearly, and this deals with the foundation of the self-encounter. The moment where, if we understand it correctly, the encounter with the self, out of this darkness of the lived moment, becomes the basis for collectivity, or for community, for recognizing also the other. I think that is one of the key motives of the book, which comes out in the change that Bloch made in the 1923 edition to the very first line. In the 1918 edition he writes, Wie nun, how now? In the Absicht of the 1923 edition it is, Ich bin, wir sind. I am, we are. And there you see a movement from I to we. That movement of I to we is enabled by what he calls the inconstructible question. This is all just introduction. We'll have to see how that works out. Yeah? And what it means. And music is also, of course, par excellence, a communicative art. As it were, yeah? And so that is Selbstbegegnung, and then we get this thing on Marx, death, and apocalypse. That's in itself, of course, a very strange combination to talk about Marx, death, and apocalypse in one breath. So those are two parts in which the book splits up, and that we see if we go to the introduction to the 1923 edition, we see roughly the same thing but with a bit more detail. We see die Selbstbegegnung, again Erzeugung des Ornaments. The chapter on der komische Held has been struck from this edition. We go straight into the philosophy of music, again the longest part of the book. There are subsections here which correspond roughly to paragraphs in the 1918 edition, but these are not indicated there. And then we get also not the chapter on the Gedankenatmosphäre dieser Zeit, that's also struck. So very interesting. I think he was a little bit ashamed of himself, because there were apart from very good discussions on Husserl, there are really strange remarks about Catholicism and about the Enlightenment and about Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, etc. I think he didn't want to have anything to do with anymore. But we then get also the Gestalt der unkonstruierbaren Frage, in which several changes have been made in the structure. And then we get Karl Marx, der Tod der Apokalypse, and now with a subtitle, Oder über die Weltwege vermittels derer das Inwendige auswendig und das Auswendige wie das Inwendige werden kann. Is that also, can I quickly see if that's in the English tradition? Translation? Seems to have been completely disappeared there.
They're not giving all of the sections.
But he says it in the book itself. Karl Marx, Death and the Apocalypse, or the ways in this world by which the inward can become outward and the outward like the inward. And that, of course, is the motive of inside going out, the expressionist motive, but also the dialectical motive, and then ending in the same way. Yeah? So that is how the book is set up, as an exploration of this figure of Selbstbegegnung, and then moving into a discussion of how the self externalizes itself in objectivity and what happens in that moment, in that movement. Now, as I said, I've made a schedule for how we are going to tackle this in 5 sessions. And rather than reading that out to you, I will just email it. So everyone who is not on the German philosophy email list that we have for the seminar, please give me your email address. I will add it, and then I will send that around. And so there will be quite a bit of course, it's about 100 pages per week that we will be reading, because it is per 2 weeks. We meet every 2 weeks, because the 1923 edition is sort of the starting point, but wherever there are significant changes in the 1918 edition, I'll indicate those pages, so you can read those as well, and then move on as we discuss it. Okay, how are we doing for time? 4:45. Okay, so we have 45 minutes left. Okay, do you want a little break? or are we okay? No, it's fine. Okay. And any questions at this point or comments?
Yeah, I've got a question about translation. So when you read the first paragraph out, second paragraph, I should say, the Faust was translated as well. It was an abstract translation. I mean, my understanding of Faust is hand or fist, and I think you had it as intention and goal or something like that, aim and end.
We want to be its initiative and we want to be its end.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a very big difference. That's not Faust. No, it's true.
But I mean, is the translator? I mean, is it permissible to make that kind of? Because I mean, German is so concrete anyway that maybe we'd be misrepresenting it if we left it as concrete because English isn't. I mean, what's happening there?
Yeah, what's happening there? Yeah, that's a good question.
Well, Bloch is very hard to translate. It's not so much the words, but it's how you get across that thing that you were talking about, which is extremely experimental concept. So when you're translating, I think Kat says this at some point, something she's written, you're also transcending what he's actually written. So you have to look for something that's kind of that accounts for the intention in the original text. And most of the translations that are done at Bloch are problematical in some way. Some of them are just downright bad. But they're certainly problematical precisely because it's hard to pin down what he means here by Faust. What does he mean by Faust? So wollen wir ihm, seine Faust und seine Ziele werden. So the ihm there is to it. It needs to be for this thing. It needs to be its fist. It needs to be something that's going to break it down. It's like it's Nietzsche again. It's the philosopher with a hammer. He wants to come in and smash this up, and then it gets turned into what in the English version?
Initiative. Yeah.
It seems very weak.
He could just have said fist, couldn't he? Yeah.
Or hammer.
Oh, hammer. Yeah.
Because there's and I think there's lots of Nietzsche here, which will need to
I heard nihilism, and I thought that was a Nietzschean theme.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, this is an overcoming of nihilism without saying nihilism is bad or we have to get rid of it, but to say, well, when you live through nihilism, Bloch says you can come out with hope.
Nietzsche had the same belief.
Nietzsche of course had the same belief, in a way.
It's sort of active nihilism.
Yeah.
You live it through it and you see it through.
He says at some point he describes it as overcoming analytical nihilism and replacing it with something different, but not moving away from nihilism. It's still the recognition that the world is essentially nihilistic, but how do you work with that and overcome that, and how do you smash up the nihilism? How do you negate the negation, which is overcoming nihilism? And I think he does that quite confusingly, but that's certainly what's underpinned it. Because he never slips into, I mean, although it's a kind of subjective idealism, he never slips into real Basquiaism.
No, he's far beyond that here.
Far beyond.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it has to, he stays with the idea that what exists is purely stock, but how do you deal with that? And that's what the Faust here, I think, in this first paragraph is supposed to do. That's to smash up stock. To say stock is not just this clots, as he calls it, done.
Yeah, but it is the now in which something can begin.
Yeah, but it's just this moment in the process of stuff that we're kind of obsessed with. And how do you get beyond
exactly, and
similar thing in Nietzsche as well, because Nietzsche felt science would lead you to the aesthetic ideal. The aesthetic ideal, one form of it is the scientist. And he thought that matter and all these categories we use are actually imposed on nature. In nature there are no matter and no chairs and things. And we impose these categories on things. There is always the becoming.
Yeah.
So what's inside is actually always very fluid. But we impose the structure on the world.
That's right. So now, that's absolutely true. For Bloch, there is always the moment. There's not just fluidity. So the process is always one of interruptions. I think that's an important. He links that to materialism. He says what the difference between dialectical materialism and dialectical idealism is that dialectical materialism works with ruptures, negations that cannot be mediated, and that's also the moment of Faust. It's the moment where you say now something else begins. That's again, but you see how that also goes back to Kierkegaard.
I suppose the Faust would also link back to the, sort of Handel as well.
Yeah, of course. Yes, exactly. So, and this is very religious formulation. Unsere Hände ist das Leben gegeben. And what do? We make a fist. We don't. Exactly. But life has to be taken up as something that has to be lived, and it doesn't. It does not have an essence of itself. It's not what it is. We have to follow it. We have to make it into what it is. We have to make it. We have to make it into its goal. He says. We have to become its goal. We have to become its fist. We have to become that which makes it, and we have to become its goal. We are the ones who are becoming who we are. To quote Nietzsche. I think, and there is and I think this goes back to what Peter says, the ambiguity in the whole book in terms of. So, to what extent does Bloch work with the idea that there is a kind of a final end state in which everything has come to itself, or to what extent there is just form after form, which is much more a Nietzschean sort of strict nihilistic point of view. I think Bloch tries to develop here the idea that this moment of now, you might say utopia is the moment of now, experienced as a dynamic movement in which the now breaks out into the new, or into the not yet. And that is what he calls hope. So there isn't an eternal present that we, like in Zen fashion or in some interpretations of Nietzsche, we don't go into a world in which we come to live in the pure present moment and that's it. When we do that, we discover that the present moment has an orientation, that it moves us out of ourselves. The moment moves out of itself in an attempt to become itself. We start hungry, he says. We can't stand ourselves. We want to go out, we want to be fed, we need other things, and in that way we become ourselves.
So is that a modification of Hegelian teleology? A slight modification? Well, I mean, because in Nietzsche you don't have the teleology.
No, exactly, but here you do. Well, this is the big...
You don't,
yeah. This, I think the question is how to think about the teleology. I think that's one of the big questions in the book. Yeah, and in his whole philosophy. Yeah.
Because he calls it teleology without a telos.
Yeah.
That's the difference.
Because the telos isn't there yet.
Telos isn't there yet, and any teleology is retrospective. We've reached this point where we are here now. This is our telos. But it was never written down that we would at this point in history now be sitting here. This thing about Haeckel that came up at the conference on Monday, he was comparing with Bloch, who believed that the human being was already laid down in the first bacteria, and that everything was there just to create this human being, just as a teleological idea. Whereas if you look at it, I mean, of course it was. The human being was laid down in the first bacteria, but only retrospectively.
Yeah.
And he says that in here at some point. There's a long excursus about how human beings came about out of bacteria
And he talks exactly, and he gives sort of an a priori rationale for the difference between the sexes, that there has to be that, and
but in order to get here, we had to go through all those stages, but we didn't have to go through all those stages. It could have been something different. So there's this sort of gradual construction of what exists out of the existent. So it's a process that has a blind process. And that's
a blind process, but then once in the event there is the human being, there is what is now, and I think that's important in this little paragraph at the beginning here. In unser Händes das Leben gegeben, und ich mag wohl talk about this for myself. Für sich selber ist das Leben schon leer geworden. So for life, for itself, what was without intent, the possibility of action, intention, and so on, recognition, reflection, has become empty for itself. So I think that it's important for Bloch that precisely the metaphor of the hands, and that in the human being that is in the event fortuitous, and opens up a possibility that wasn't there before.
Yeah, that's right.
That takes you to the end of the principle of hope as well.
And the principle of hope, you get the reference to Arbeit. It says the working, belabouring human being. That is history, and that's the hand here. And it's interesting. I was I'm really into all the religious connotations. That the rule of Saint Benedictine speaks of ora et labora, pray and work. And so the book begins with hands. And it ends right at the end with Wahrheit als Gebet. So truth as prayer. So there is a strange constellation here between the hands and the expectation in thought as the locus of truth. That's what it's a prayer, but it's not, as you wrote in your paper, it's a prayer in a godless world. But still, it's a prayer as almost a rhetorical genre in its own right. Prayer is that which gives us access to truth, and prayer is also like improvisation in music. Prayer is the living into the not yet, the expectation or anticipation. So there is a deep connection between hands and between praying and working, and between the hands and the mouth. And Faust is of course also a socialist symbol, isn't it? And so Bloch writes somewhere else, I don't know if it's here, but he says somewhere when he talks about socialism also having a metaphysical meaning or a spiritual meaning, he says there are also red secrets in the world, red mysteries. And then he says, well, or even better, there are only red mysteries. There are only red secrets. Es gibt nur rote Geheimnisse. This is in a way is a red rotes Geheimnis.
The same messianism is the red secret of every revolution.
Yeah. And the last section on the philosophy of music is called Das Geheimnis. It's called. I think this problem or this question, what is the status of teleology? Bloch is definitely saying the abolishment of teleology by science is something that philosophically we cannot live with. But what does it mean to bring it back, or what does it mean to have a concept of teleology in philosophy? And so I've given you now this metaphor of the improvisation musician as somebody who has a teleology without a telos. He does it for a reason. It's for something. It's not for nothing. There is a hope or an expectation, but there's not a. It could go in a different direction.
It's a little bit like when Benjamin refers to other things such as Biographical, I think it's teleology or metaphysics.
Yeah.
Except that of course the messianic in Benjamin I think is to be equated with the nihilistic, so it's an archaeological platform.
Can you explain that a bit more?
I think there's a convergence of Give me a moment. Let's
there is a
continue.
convergence between messianism and nihilism in Benjamin,
Yeah.
and that is not. That seems to be different in Bloch.
Yeah, absolutely.
I
This is
agree
what
with that
this is what I mean.
completely. Yeah.
So I think these are motifs which
Yeah.
Benjamin inherits from Bloch.
Yeah. Yeah.
But puts to work in a slightly different way, certainly later as well.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, we can see some of this, and to give this discussion a bit more fuel, in what I think is a wonderful story in Spuren. It's also a story that I think Buber, in a slightly different version, pens up in his Chassidische Geschichten. So I think it's an old story which Bloch may have changed a little bit. I haven't researched that in detail. And it is about a rabbi asking God next to whom he will sit over there in heaven. And the answer is quite shocking to him. I wanted to bring the English version in the Traces edition, but it's out of the library. So for those who do not speak German, I'm going to ask you to stick with it. First we will listen to Jan Robert Bloch, Bloch's son, read it out to us, and then I will summarize the content, and then we will discuss it. And I think it has a lot to do with the point that you raised just now. So it is a Hasidic or even Kabbalistic tale, and it is part of a longer section in the book Spuren, which is called Motive der Verborgenheit, Motives of Concealment. And Jan Robert died 2 years ago. But before he died, he was touring Germany with an evening program of readings from Spuren, in which his wife, who is a violinist, played the violin. It's all very much homegrown, as we say in Dutch, between the sliding doors. But very sweet, I think, very sweet. I hope it works. Oh, I've given you the handout. It's after the letter. I've given you the text, so you can read with it. After the letter, page 125. Yeah. In the middle. So folgt die chassidische Geschichte, again a reference to Nietzsche, tiefer als der Tag gedacht und tiefer als selbst der Rabbi Raphael von Belz sein sonderbares Erlebnis zuerst begriffen hat. Tiefer als der Tag gedacht, that is the wanderer, what is it called?
Wanderer Shadow.
No, the lead at the end of Zarathustra. Die Welt ist tiefer als die Tag gedacht. Yeah, no. Sorry. Intertextual reference that leaves me now. Now it's not working. It was working just now. Yeah, here we go. First we get a bit of...
Am Ende folgt eine chassidische Geschichte, tiefer als der Tag gedacht und tiefer als selbst der Rabbi Raphael von Belz sein sonderbares Erlebnis zuerst begriffen hat. Dem war einst, während er träumte, ein Engel erschienen. Neben wen werde ich dort drüben sitzen? Fragte ihn der Rabbi. Du wirst drüben neben Yitzhak Leib aus Lodz sitzen, sagte der Engel und verschwand. Nun war der Rabbi Raphael berühmt wegen seiner Frömmigkeit und geheimen Wissenschaft in ganz Israel. Neben wem werde ich dort drüben sitzen? Neben Yitzhak Leib? Ich habe im ganzen Leben seinen Namen noch nicht gehört. Am nächsten Tag ließ der Rabbi anspannen und machte sich auf den weiten Weg nach Lodz. Es war Freitagnachmittag, als er ankam, und ließ sich sogleich beim Vorsteher der Gemeinde melden. Der empfing mit Ehrfurcht den großen Kabbalisten, aber von Yitzhak Leib konnte er ihm nichts berichten. Sie fragten gemeinsam weiter bei den älteren Männern, bei den Jungen, eben erst zugezogenen, lange vergebens, bis endlich der und jener sich zu erinnern glaubte, an der Mauer wohnt einer, der viel auf Reisen ist und sich nie blicken lässt. Wir glauben, das ist Yitzhak Leib. Der Rabbi ließ sich den Weg durch das hölzerne Lodge zeigen, das damals noch ein Dorf war. Es kamen die ersten Sterne, als er vor der richtigen Türe stand, und er freute sich, den Sabbateingang mit dem Frommen zu teilen. Aber Yitzhak Leib war nicht zu Hause. Er hat Geschäfte, sagte ein altes Weib auf der Straße und grinste. Geschäfte am Freitagabend? Der Rabbi wusste nicht, was er von den Worten halten sollte. Nun, dann werde ich im Hause auf ihn warten. Er saß lange in der Stube und dachte an seinen Traum, blickte auf das armselige Gerät und es fiel ihm das Wort des Rabbi Eliezer ein, der Mensch sei leichter zu erlösen als zu ernähren. Er dachte an den Sabbat der oberen Welten und wie er ihn feiern wolle, mit dem, der von dort her kam. Er dachte an Gideon, der die Sonne angehalten hatte, und ans Krüglein der Witwe, an David und Jonathan. Da trat Yitzhak Leib ein ganz verkommener alter Mann und, wie es schien, betrunken. Kaum sah Leib den Gast, so fragte er misstrauisch, ob er noch einen Handel mit ihm machen wolle. Nein, Yitzhak Leib, ich habe euch besucht, weil der Rabbi kam nicht weiter, denn der Leib hatte schon zu essen begonnen, ohne auch nur das Tischgebet gesprochen zu haben. Aber Yitzhak Leib, ihr habt ja noch nicht einmal den Segen gesprochen. Der armselige Mann schüttelte den Kopf und sagte, er habe das Beten verlernt. Und der Rabbi sprach die Worte für ihn. Als der Rabbi aber auch dann noch nach dem Ende des Mahls und vielen Aufforderungen Yitzhak Leibs, unter denen nur keine zum Essen war, kein Geschäft vorschlug, wurde der Schächer zornig und warf seinen Gast mit vielen Flüchen aus dem Haus. Da stand nun der Rabbi auf der Straße im verlorenen Sabbat und im eigenen Spiegel. Also, neben diesem großen Sünder werde ich dort drüben sitzen. Wahrhaftig Gott, ich muss sagen, du hast kuriose Einfälle, und schlug ohnmächtig hin. Als ihn ein Mann fand, war es schon Tag, und er ließ sich den Weg nach der Herberge zeigen und befahl dem Knecht augenblicklich anzuspannen nach Belz zurück. Alle Würden wollte er abtun und sich kasteien, damit ihm Gott seine große Sünde zeige und vielleicht vergebe. Fühllos saß er im Wagen und merkte nicht, wie sie an einen Fluss gekommen waren, der Hochwasser führte und hatte fast schon die Brücke zertrümmert, nur halb erfasste der Wagen auf den Bodengrund. Glücklich waren sie hinüber, da hörte man vom Ufer rückwärts Lärm und sah den Yitzhak Leib, wie er auf der Brücke sprang und rief, und nach ihnen rief. Da schrie der Rabbi ihn an, ihr könnt nicht kommen, die Brücke ist entzwei. Da warf Yitzhak Leib sein Kaftan ins Wasser und fuhr auf ihm quer übers Wasser, den Fluss herüber ans Land. Das Gebet hat mir doch gefallen, sagte Yitzhak Leib. So habe ich es zuletzt von meinem Vater gehört, aber ihr müsst es mir noch einmal sagen, ich habe ein schwaches Gedächtnis. Und die Worte, ich kann sie nicht behalten. Yitzhak Leib, sagte Rabbi Raphael und weinte, was kann ich euch lehren? Gebt mir euren Segen. Yitzhak Leib schüttelte den Kopf, legte dem Knienden die Hände aufs Haupt, warf seinen Kaftan wieder aufs Wasser und trieb stehend zurück. Rabbi Raphael aber fuhr sehr getröstet zurück in die heilige Stadt Belz.
Okay. So, not everyone got the story, I think, huh? No. So very quickly, the Rabbi Raphael of Belz, was a very wise man, honored all of Israel for his secret knowledge. and his pious way of life. He asked, an angel visited him one day, and he asked the angel, next to whom will I sit on the other side in heaven? And the angel said, you will sit next to Yitzhak Leib aus Lotz. Yeah? Now this Mr. Leib aus Lotz, he was unknown. Rabbi Raphael had never heard of him, but he wanted to meet him and went to the city of Bloch to find out who this man was. Nobody in the Jewish community knew who he was, however. But after a while, some people seem to recall that there was somebody who was away a lot, traveling, living on the edge of town, and that would be Yitzhak Leib. The rabbi went through the city that was at that time still made of wood, to the end of town, to the house where this man was supposed to live, but there was no one there. It was a Friday night at the beginning of the Sabbath. An old woman in the street said to the rabbi, he's not here yet because he's still doing business. And the rabbi, of course, was beginning to suspect the worst, because doing business on a Friday night is not quite in line with pious behavior of a rabbi. So after a while he comes home, Yitzhak Leib, he is drunk. He asks him he asks the rabbi if he wants to do another business with him, and then he begins to eat without even praying, as is the custom, of course. The rabbi is stupefied and says, you haven't even prayed, let me pray for you, because Leib has said that he doesn't know the words anymore. He hasn't prayed for such a long time that he doesn't know how to do it anymore. After a while, and Yitzhak Leib tries to get business out of the rabbi is not open for that. After a while, the rabbi is thrown out of the house into the street, and then it says here, there stood the rabbi in the street with a lost Sabbath and in his own mirror, looking in his own mirror, and he faints in the street. Next day, or when he wakes up and he's brought to the inn where he is staying, he decides to go back home to lay down all his honors and to sich kasteien, how do you say that in English? To punish himself so that God might show him what his great sin is, because he thinks I'm as sinful as this man here. To show him his sin and maybe forgive him. He's going back home. He is sitting senseless in his coach when they come to a river in which the water has risen and has almost demolished the bridge. The cart manages to get over the bridge, but then the bridge collapses, I think is implied in the story. When he's on the other side of this river, Yitzhak Leib is heard in the distance shouting at the rabbi, wanting to come over. The rabbi says, you can't come over. Of course, he doesn't want to see him either. You can't come over anymore. The bridge is broken. And then what happens? Yitzhak Leib takes off his kaftan, throws it onto the water, stands on it, and floats to the other side of the river. And he says, I did like that prayer that you said. That's the way I heard it last time from my father, but I've got a very bad memory. Can you say it again to me? Because I can't remember the words. Then the rabbi breaks out crying and says, Yitzhak Leib, what can I learn you? Please give me your blessing. Yitzhak Leib shakes his head, puts his hands on the head of the kneeling rabbi, throws his kaftan back onto the water, and floats standing straight up back to the other side of the river. And then the last sentence is, the Rabbi Raphael drove back, much comforted, drove back to the holy city of bells. I think that's the story. So, what do you make of that? What does it mean? Does it ring any bells, or does it do anything to you?
Outwardly pious and not always most righteous.
The fact that he can cross the river on his coat or his it's somewhat like Jesus.
Yeah, that's a Christological moment. Yeah, that's right. That's right. In the motive of water is for Bloch also very important. this motive of walking on the water, learning to walk on the water, is almost a moment of learned hope. And there's a discussion of water in Geist und Utopie, but we will get to that maybe later on the term. So that's an important point. Yeah, it's a form of magic, but what is it? What could it signify?
Well, it seems to be impossible, but it is possible. That he has powers, that he has certain powers, and again, like Jesus, and that maybe that despite not praying and despite behaving disrespectfully against his religion, he seems to be God seems to like him despite it all.
Kind of an anti-orthodoxy message to it, isn't there? Sorry. I feel like there's an anti-orthodoxy undertone that the man doesn't practice the rules as they're supposed to be practiced, but still he's able to perform that miracle, essentially.
It reminds me of this saying about bumblebees, that if bumblebees knew that they can't fly because they're too heavy for their
say that again. Say it again.
Like, I don't know whether it's scientific or not, but like lots of people told me already, is saying that if bumblebees knew that they can't physically fly because they're too heavy, then they couldn't, because they don't know.
They can.
So it reminds me of this, like this dithyrambic, he represents rather the sort of intuitive knowledge, which is not really cognitive knowledge or faith or thought, but it's just behavior and experience, and he just does it. Whereas the rabbi is then sort of represents very cognitive approach to life and to what is possible and what is not possible. That's his contrast.
I think the name is important as well somehow. It seems symbolic to me, because Yitzhak is obviously means he will laugh, I think, and life is obviously the body. So it seems to have some kind of futurity, physicality, kind of the human body will be able to do things, or is able to do things that, I don't know, there's a symbolism in the name too.
That's right, yeah. And Raphael as well, as of course Raphael the Archangel. There's also a story in the book, but you don't know that it's Raphael ohne Hände, which is a description of this picture by painting by, I think, Titian, or no, was it? No, Raphael without hands, the artist, who's unable to materialize. But I think, why is the rabbi question? Why is the rabbi comforted? Sehr getröstet fuhr zurück in die heilige Stadt Belz.
Well, because he is going to be sitting next to a good man.
Exactly.
In the eyes of his impression.
Yeah. So the way I read it is, the rabbi hasn't learned anything from the story.
Yeah.
That's the catch of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very nice.
Yeah.
Possibly bringing the rabbi down to be humble towards other people.
Yeah.
Because it rings a bell with the story in Quran. I don't even know whether it's in the Bible. It's about Moses. Because Moses was very powerful and so on.
Yeah.
And he comes walking along the sea, and then he found someone on the sea in Arab, Khadr, which have some connotation, because Khadr means, the icon means green actually. The color green is Khadr.
Yeah.
And he gets impressed by him, and he says, let me just be your companion. He said, you can't be my companion. And he insists on him, Moses insists on taking him with him. And then he said, if you come with me, don't ask me what I do until I explain to you. And then there are sequence of 3 things that happened. Moses doesn't really know the logic of them. They looks on the face of it outrageous. And first time it happened, Moses objects. He said, I told you not to ask me. You go off. He said, no, please forgive me, I forgot. And then he said for the next one, and it's happened. The third one he said, absolutely not. After this, you're not staying with me, but I'll explain that to you. And he shows them what's the will of God in every instance. And Moses is supposed to be a prophet.
Yeah.
So he is missed out. There's a difference between just to show Moses that there is actually some knowledge that he misses out.
Yeah,
so
yeah, exactly.
He doesn't become arrogant.
No, yeah. The rabbi maybe also doesn't become arrogant and realizes maybe that there's something. Yeah, maybe realizes there is more than what he understands. That die Welt ist tiefer als Tag gedacht. But could also be that he just thinks, I got off okay. I'm still good for a good place, good place up there.
And his name, Light. His family name Light.
Yeah.
I was wondering if that might mean that he really lives, that he, in contrast to the rabbi, who is following all the rules, and he does the opposite, but that means that he has a fuller life. I mean, life is body. Life is a German word for body, for flesh.
Yeah.
It's interesting also because he's called body, he's called life, which is a very physical thing.
Yeah.
It's a torso.
Yes.
But he overcomes materiality.
Yes.
He overcomes the materiality of gravity, of water, and the rest of it, without even realizing it. He's very nonchalant. He just jumps on his coat and sails across the water, says hello, and comes back again in a very cartoonish way. But his very physicality overcomes materiality, and I think that's very much in the spirit of Bloch, in the spirit of Utopia. That it's only through sort of unthinking materiality or the reality of matter that you overcome the matter, that you then become something different. You become who you are. Not, it's almost kind of Zen-like, not by doing all the right things and following the right prescriptions and doing the right dogmas and saying the right prayers, but just by being. And by being, you overcome your life and become something different. That's I think what I take from it.
Yeah.
And what did you say Yitzhak stands for?
It's like Isaac. It means he will laugh. Those olive names in that group. That's what it means. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, because Isaac was the one who survived the near death.
But what is also interesting is that this Yitzhak life, apparently for him to pray was also very important, otherwise he wouldn't have made all the way, and also maybe he wouldn't have been able to switch off his mind and just pass this river. So it's like
ambiguous,
from both
isn't it?
sides.
I mean, when I first read that story, I didn't know whether it was implied that it was because he had learned to pray again that he was able to do that.
Well, the prayer got him back on the straight and narrow because the last time we met him he was drunk and wanted to conduct business and stuff.
Yeah, or whether or not that is seen as important, just the fact of him being able to perform this miracle, essentially, this amazing task, whether that was kind of because he learned to pray again, he was able to do that. I think it's not clear, really.
And also, I just think in Abendmahl, this is in English.
Last Supper.
Yes.
Last Supper, yeah.
Well, what the Christian Church does regularly, the priest blesses them and gives out
communion.
these. Sorry?
Communion.
Yeah. And he says, in German, he says, der Wein ist mein Blut. And other stuff.
Biscuit.
My life. My life.
Yeah, because life also means
But
love,
again,
right?
it's
I mean, that life also
connection to
is love,
Jesus.
right?
Yeah. Isn't there also a loaf of bread? Isn't that also called a life? Yeah. The loaf of bread is also a life.
Jesus also
Yeah, that is spelled differently.
Yeah, I know, but it sounds the same.
Yeah, it sounds the same.
water, and that's the moment of messianic recognition. It's his ability to walk on water.
Yeah.
Peter tries to follow him, but he loses his faith as he's walking and realises what he's doing, and that's when he falls. And that's when he loses the power of nature when he becomes conscious.
Yeah. So this faith, it is. Yeah, I have to. Sorry, I should have looked it up. What Bloch writes about is about the moment where faith enables you to walk over the water, and then he makes a comparison between that walking over the water of Christ and the spirit of God hovering over the waters in the beginning of Genesis. And he also speaks of the water in the Freudian psychoanalysis. The water is always the metaphor for the unconscious. So there is also, I can't develop this now, but there is also a relation to that element. Yeah.
I don't know if this is a frivolous point, but I just wondered, it struck me that in his use of the captain to cross the river, it seemed that the symbolic, in a sense, is being reduced to the function. And so it's almost sort of, I don't know, satirical or mocking almost, that he's using this in a way that uses it, so it gives it a purpose, as if it wouldn't have any other purpose.
Yeah.
And this is his means to get across to the other side, and apart from that, he's no real use for it.
Yeah.
It's a definite, it's a multi-layered play on the idea of materiality going on here, isn't there? Like, what it means for something to have material use, value or purpose, or what it means for something to be, I don't know, an obstacle or not, an enabler or an obstacle.
And he is throwing off his coat, isn't he? So presumably, we don't know, but it could be cold in Lodge, but he might be standing there naked. but certainly he has taken off his coat. That's another motive that we get at the beginning of philosophy of music, where he speaks about we begin to tremble and throw off our coats when we hear the sound of music. Yeah.
Was it actually originally written by him, or is something?
I'm not 100% sure, but I think it is a Hasidic tale that he found in maybe in a slightly different version in Martin Buber's collection of Hasidic tales. Martin Buber made a collection of folk tales from the Hasidic Central European Jewish population in the early 20th century. I think that's where it goes back to.
It's all the traces that are still, folk tales.
Not some of it is things he made up himself. Other things are based on stories he read in the newspaper. Some are retellings of stories by others. He even got into trouble for plagiarism when he published the book. Some people said, "Well, this is my story." Yeah. But he says in the next sentence, "Ist diese Geschichte nichts, sagen die Märchenerzähler in Afrika, so gehört sie dem, der sie erzählt hat. Ist sie etwas, so gehört sie uns allen." So if the story means anything, the storytellers in Africa say it belongs to if it means nothing, it belongs to the person who's told it. If it means something, it belongs to all of us.
Because the reason why I ask, because there are such stories in Islamic mysticism.
Yeah.
Because what happened is that the which we call Arabic Baha, which is people who are of the law, lawyers of the law.
Yeah.
They would want to be follow the law, that's being Sabbath, be drinking, and all the rest.
Yeah.
But the mystics, there is a level of mysticism where they think they are above the law.
Yeah.
They are actually very close to God.
Yeah.
The law doesn't apply to them anymore.
Exactly.
This group of people think that they can drink, they can whatever they do is not affecting their faith.
Yeah.
So
that's very interesting. Yeah. And I know that in Hasidic Jewish spirituality there is also this moment where it becomes an act of extreme piety to break the laws. Yeah, so to deliberately work on the Sabbath or whatever. Yeah, they become, and that is a fulfillment of the law, as it were.
So as we should say, beyond good and evil.
Yeah, exactly. Yes.
Well, that's the radical Protestant idea as well. I mean, if the divine light is in everybody, then nothing you can do could possibly be wrong.
Yeah.
So the Vanters and the
yes, of course. Yeah.
And presumably this ties in with Bloch's studies of Munzer.
Yeah. It links very much to the lay mysticism movement, to Böhme, who was of course part of that. Yeah. And
from Spain.
Yeah, exactly.
Jewish.
And here also sort of the Ranters and the Quakers and Blake. Those are very important motives for Bloch. That's absolutely true. Yeah.
I think Hasidism vis-a-vis kind of rabbinic Judaism in its inception is a series of breaks. I mean, when this stuff first came about in this happening in Russia and so on, I think it was considered outrageous.
Yes.
The notion that you should be dancing and celebrating and stuff. That's not a life of dedicated study of scripture. Right? This is, and I think probably there's still a divide even amongst the Orthodox, right? Which of these things is and which is not acceptable. And I mean, the celebration of levitating rabbis and so on, I think, caused maybe some rightful outrage amongst those that consider themselves most staunchly monotheistic. Right?
Yeah.
Because it does blur, some long established boundaries.
Yes, yeah. But that's right, and it's symbolized here in the fact that the rabbi needs a cart and a bridge which is about to break under the torrent of the water in order to go from the place beyond the law to the place of the law, whereas the Yitzhak Leib can just sail from one to the other without any effort. Yeah?
He still needs the kaftan.
He still needs the kaftan.
Why doesn't he just go walk across the water?
Yeah.
What does the kaftan function does it have?
Yeah. I think that's what Jeremy was saying. The functionality. Yeah, there is a material practice necessary.
But you're right to make the point that he does still need it. It's not enough that he has enough faith or that he's trusted by God or something like that.
No.
Maybe he made a quick coracle out of it.
But I think the kaftans are profane object of everyday use, and the kaftan is not. This is something the Jews wore or wear, but it's not. This is not like a headwear or something.
Yeah, that would have been different, wouldn't it? If he,
There's Joseph's coat from never comes. I'm trying to remember what significance that has.
What was that, sorry?
In the Torah, Joseph's coat never comes. That has some to do with identity.
That's what it put me in mind of as well. I wondered about that.
I mean, traditional Hasidic attire is just, kind of fashioned to fit in with, the kind of ethnic aristocracy of 17th century Poland or something like this. But, it was cold and hence the fresh drying and so on. These are not things that are prescribed per se, they're customary.
Can I just mention something which kind of links into this, but in terms of themes, I can't remember who pointed this out. I read recently that in Geist, someone makes the point that Bloch, the theme of the wanderer, the figure of the wanderer, is extremely important still in Bloch's thought at that point, which kind of dies away a little bit later. And this story also has that kind of idea in it, and also the Jewish connection, the Jew as a wanderer and so on. So that I think links into the question that we want to look at going on about teleology and what the status of that is. What's the status of the wanderer? What's the status of the journey?
Yeah.
Just anyway, I just want to take that point because of my opinion.
Yeah, exactly. Because the goal of the rabbi is very clear. He wants to have a good place in heaven. We don't know anything about the goal of the.
No, and this, the prayer is the crucial thing there, isn't it?
Yeah.
The goal is to. If prayer can be seen as a goal or can be seen as a destination, then it's only a destination that takes you as far as setting off to the next destination.
Yeah.
This is the perfectly Hasidic viewpoint where you're supposed to kind of take pleasure in the act of praying and so on. There is something very basically physical almost about the dancing, the singing, like the storytelling. This is something that in rabbinic Judaism you don't really have time for. But I'm not quite sure what that might mean for Bloch.
Yeah, I think with him, the idea of prayer is more broad than just perhaps in Judaism. I mean, for Bloch, I would say that hope is kind of a secularized form of prayer, in a sense, like opening it, asking for something becomes, it's no longer a question that you would expect to be fulfilled and have an expectation for fulfillment, but the possibility to ask and to hope is still there in a way. But maybe what we'll get
It can also link back to the motive that I mentioned at the beginning, that the mystic needs the institution in order to be what he or she is. Okay, das Gebet hat mir doch gefallen. So I did like the prayer in the end. I think we need to close on that thought and maybe take that into the next session.
Sorry, what was that?
Das Gebet hat mir doch gefallen.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Fine.
Yeah. So okay, I'll send you a schedule, but just for next time, I would like to start with pages 11 to 48 in the 1923 edition. So that is basically Absicht to the end of Erzeugung des Ornaments. So right up until the beginning, up until philosophy of music. Yeah? And then for those who are reading the German, that's in 11 to 48 in the 1923 edition. And then to add to that, from the 1918 edition, Ein alter Krug, which is slightly different in the 1918 version than in the 1923 version. It's a very important metaphor, the old jar, which actually in Heidegger comes back in a very unacknowledged way. And then also from the 1918 edition, Der komische Held, which is the section that was left out of the 1923 edition. And for those who are reading the English only, it would be up until page 33. Yeah.
Are we at any point going to talk about this conversation between Bloch and Dom?
Yeah, I sort of gave that as a like a background reading, but it would be very good to draw that into the discussion. Of course, it's much later in time, but I think it's very important. We can certainly do that. You can bring it in any time, but we can certainly talk about that. Yeah, absolutely. I will also send around, as I said at the beginning, a list of some recommended reading that you might want to look at if you're interested in expanding your reading, and I will do that via email. So I must ask all of you who are not on the German philosophy gist mail list that I have for the seminar to put your email in clear writing on that paper, so I can add you to it, because I might also send you more stuff as we go on. Yeah. Okay. Thanks very much for your contributions. I hope it's been a bit of an inspiring start, and that we'll see you back in 2 weeks' time.